Hello, and welcome to the latest MEES podcast. My name is Jamie Ingram, Senior Editor here at MEES, and I am delighted to be joined today by James Cockayne, our Managing Editor, and Yesar Al-Maleki, our Gulf Analyst. It's been a whirlwind couple of weeks, with the eyes of the world firmly fixed on the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine following Russia's invasion. In the energy sector, the ramifications are severe, and policymakers are trying to balance a desire to cut off the oil and gas export revenues that are fueling Putin's invasion, with the reality that doing so would threaten Europe's energy security. Nobody is under any illusion that Russia's oil and gas exports can be replaced in the near term. Concerns that Russian energy could be taken off the table, combined with the very real impact of self-sanctioning, as buyers have been reluctant to be seen taking Russian oil, have caused prices to soar. OPEC Plus opted last week to stick to its plan and not accelerate the unwinding of cuts, which, to be fair, is exactly what delegates were telling us what would happen. It was also insistent after the meeting that prices are being driven by geopolitical concerns rather than genuine outages. If Russian oil is taken off the table, it's going to be interesting to see if this is sufficient to change OPEC's calculations. We then saw the price of Brent hit $139 a barrel on Monday, the highest level since the financial crisis in 2008, before dropping back once again. Meanwhile, the less said about European gas prices, the better. The IEA last week released a 10-point plan to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas, which can essentially be boiled down into two primary components. Firstly, use less gas. And secondly, when you do use it, try not to buy any of this from Russia. It calculates that in this way, Europe can cut its imports of Russian gas by more than a third. Now, Qatar is the obvious potential source of additional gas, but as we discussed in last month's episode, there are significant barriers to that option. One potential source of gas that people have been asking me about of late is Iran. Yesar, you wrote an article in the latest issue that caught my eye, in which you note that Iran has now passed its seasonal high demand point. So, does Iran have the potential to supply Europe with gas?
Thank you, Jamie. Well, not on the short term, which is, of course, important for the current framework of affairs or context of affairs. But look at it this way. We need first to ask ourselves, where does Iran send gas? Where does it export gas? Iranian gas exports to Turkey last year were in multi-year highs. Iran even overtook Azerbaijan as Turkey's second largest pipeline supply after Russia. So they sent in a record 9.75 BCM. But that is almost the full capacity of the existing 11 BCM pipeline between both countries. And this is still below the 10.22 BCM that was actually contracted. This is the same pipeline that saw outages last month for a few days during the recent cold wave that hit Turkey. If our listeners remember, this was when flights to Istanbul were cancelled. The other country is Iraq, and Iranian gas exports to Iraq have come to almost a complete halt. This winter, the full contractual volumes were supposed to be 50 million cubic meters per day, but in reality, the flows have been typically well below that. Tehran has been prioritizing its local market over Iraq because the latter has been unable to pay due to the sanctions on the financial sector of Iran itself. Iraq has reduced to Iran. Those amount to almost 4 billion. About 1.6 billion of that is actually gas related. The Turks do not have these restrictions, of course, and this seems to be why volumes going to Turkey are continuing. Now, as you said, they celebrated last week ending the consumption curbs on industry. Iran, in reality, is trying to grow its gas production capacity, which is important if they need to send in any gas to Europe, surplus gas. But they are facing a lot of challenges. These are technical and commercial. But recently they have announced that they have reached a capacity of 850 million cubic meters per day. But this winter, the supply to demand deficit was around 200 million cubic meters per day. And some Iranian officials are saying, well, this is going to grow over the next decade to 350. So Iran has a lot of demand internally. And they are planning to boost their capacity to 1.5 billion cubic meters per day, according to a plan that would cost them 80 billion. And we have reported on that, I think, in great detail in January. Now, the next question that we should ask ourselves when it comes to Iranian exports to Europe, gas exports, is think long term. Is it plausible? It is quite plausible. If Iran signs the nuclear deal, maybe even if European companies, of course, if the terms are right, enter the gas development sector in Iran. But of course, the main idea here is they are focusing on the South Pass. South Pass is already providing more than 70% of the production. And this is where capacity from different phases is scheduled to or expected to go down by 10 BCM a year starting next year. So it is difficult.
So essentially, kind of, we're looking at a situation where pipeline constraints mean that they can't really increase supplies to Turkey and then onwards to Europe by much. We've also got demand on the rise in Iran, so there's not really any spare gas to supply. And then as a supplier of gas to Iraq, they're pretty unreliable, so that might also come into play if they were sending gas onwards to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up, I think, quite perfectly.
One thing that comes to mind as well is that, we say that they've just passed the peak of demand. That's winter. It's the same season in which European demand also peaks. So presumably that's also a negative factor, given that the time when they might have extra supplies does not line up with when Europe needs it.
I mean, another point to add to this, the Iranians, they are seeing also some cross-seasonal increase in demand. So if you remember last summer, they had a lot of problems because they lost hydropower because of a drought. And they also had to put these curbs on industry in terms of electricity. And the main feedstock that they use for power generation is gas. So if they have more summers that require lots of gas and more winters, it is problematic to see a surplus going to Europe.
And then, of course, with sanctions, that means that maintenance of a lot of this gas and power sector infrastructure is not at, it's overdue maintenance. So we might just see them struggle to make do with what they have. James, if we turn to you now, kind of on the same topic, East Med gas prospects seem to have been rejuvenated by, I guess, the Abraham Accords and the start of Israeli gas flows into Europe. What's the outlook for increased gas supplies to Europe from this basin?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so as you know, MEES has been based for a long time in Nicosia. So East Med's a key area we cover. Egypt, Israel. There's been a lot of gas discovered and a lot of talk about how gas output can rise and how more can be exported. The short answer to your question is there's not going to be a lot of extra gas flowing to Europe anytime soon. Certainly not on the scale that Russia exports to Europe. But it's interesting. It's an interesting topic. Now, Egypt, despite the hype about Israel and even Cyprus, Egypt is by far the region's biggest gas producer, and it saw output rise by 16% to a record of just under 7 billion CFD for 2021. So that was great, good news. However, our analysis is that this is as high as it's going to get, at least for the short term. And if I had to guess, it might be the highest it'll ever be, just because of the shift of majors against a lot of deep water exploration. There's no real pipeline at the moment of big new fields to come on in Egypt. And also the country tends to have a very high decline rate for producing fields. Now, as we know, the biggest current producer is Eni's Zohr field, and that had some quite serious problems last year with water infiltration. Eni say that this is resolved, but we're somewhat skeptical of this, and certainly having only once briefly hit the field's 3.2 billion CFD capacity last February, it hasn't really got close since. Another new field to come on last year, Raven, which is operated by BP, has also had problems. And certainly the previous fields in BP's West Nile Delta project have seen rapid decline. So in short, I think the biggest chance Egypt's got to maintain output and therefore maintain exports, which are in the form of LNG for this year, is increased imports from Israel. So Israel, as the gas output's ramped up, this has been the big new place that the gas can go, is to Egypt in general and to Egypt's underutilized LNG export terminals in particular. Certainly, Jamie, you mentioned the Abraham Accords, which are obviously a big deal, but also a big deal for Israel, and not unrelated, to be honest, is Chevron's entry in 2020. Chevron took over Noble Energy, which were the big operator in Israel, and Chevron now has big plans to ramp up production from Israel's key Leviathan field. This would require new export projects, either a new pipeline to Egypt, or else expansion of the current route. Now, I think our EastMed editor, Pete Stevenson, he's been working a lot on these various options. I think he's got something planned for this week, which will, I don't want to spoil his powder with that, so we'll see how that goes. But
good plug there, James.
Yeah, right. Well, what happened last week, though, is Israel started for the first time sending gas to Egypt via a second route. So just to go back a bit, Leviathan started up the final day of 2019, and all exports so far from Leviathan to Egypt have been via the offshore EastMed gas pipeline, which, going further back, was a pipeline that was initially built to supply Egyptian gas to Israel. So that gives you an idea of how things have shifted. Now, this route is currently operating more or less at capacity, which is about 400 million CFD. And there were plans to expand this with an extra linking pipeline within Israel. This has got delayed. So therefore, the Chevron and its Israeli partners have tapped up the so-called Arab gas pipeline in Jordan to pipe gas via Jordan to Egypt. And these shipments started last week, and the idea is that they'll ramp up to raise overall Israel to Egypt gas shipments to around 650 million CFDs. That's twice current volumes. So our overall take is that the best hope Egypt has of raising LNG exports is with this additional Israeli gas. Frankly, my default presumption would be that these volumes will probably do no more than counteract decline in Egypt, and the best guess would be that LNG exports would be level this year rather than rise. Certainly, Eni, on their recent Q4 call, the forecast they had for LNG exports from the terminal they control in Egypt was that volumes will be more or less steady with 2021, and that would be my expectation. So therefore, yeah, if anyone's expecting a massive boost of LNG exports from Egypt or from Israel indirectly via Egypt, then that's probably not going to happen. Obviously, longer term, there's plans for Leviathan to ramp up, which could translate into more LNG exports from Egypt, or even could translate into a FLNG, a floating LNG project off Israel as well. But that's not going to be something that happens this side of 2025, I wouldn't say.
So circle 2021 is the high point for Egypt gas production then, and offset declines there with Israeli flows.
I'd say so. We'll see what happens. Obviously, if I end up being right, then we can replay this. If not, we can just bin it. But
how about just over the border in Cyprus?
I think, Cyprus has had 3 gas discoveries. Aphrodite was the first one. It was made late 2011, and now this is operated by Chevron. And there's been talk of developing Aphrodite as a tie-in with Leviathan Phase 2 development, with both fields being operated by Chevron. This really depends on 2 things. Firstly, it depends on the the development option for Leviathan being a pipeline to Egypt, a new offshore pipeline to Egypt. The idea is that Aphrodite would then tie into this pipeline. It's around 4 TCF. The size of Aphrodite doesn't really justify standalone development. It's 200 odd kilometers offshore. It's 2,000 odd meters water depth. It's a decent sized field, but it's not Leviathan. It's not Zor. It's a much smaller size than that. So if Leviathan gets developed via a direct pipeline to one of Egypt's 2 LNG terminals, then there's a chance that one of the options anyway would be that there'd be a side pipeline from Aphrodite tapping into this. The other thing that's a potential spanner in the works, though, is that there still isn't a unitization agreement between Cyprus and Israel. I mean, frankly, if I was advising the Cypriot Energy Ministry, I'd tell them to pull out their finger on this, because there's enough impediments to the development of the field already.
This is because there's quite a large part of the field that is across into Israeli waters, right?
It's just about 5% by most estimates. It's only a small portion. You would think it's not a complicated agreement. Both from a geopolitical perspective, it's in both Israel and Cyprus's interest to have these fields developed. I mean, for Israel, from a foreign policy perspective, anything that ties Israel into its neighbors and, makes, Egypt or Jordan or Cyprus even tied into Israel. Israel's been very proactive with what's called the East Med Gas Forum, which is a regional grouping. Obviously, the Israelis, from a foreign policy perspective, love being part of any regional forum where, they're treated as a regular country. Not just Jordan and Egypt are members of this forum, the Palestinian Authority is as well. And the Cypriots love this forum because Turkey's not part of it. So, it's not Turkey forum, I sometimes call it. But, so this is a forum where it's really furthers the foreign policy aims of Israel and Cyprus. And you would think getting a unitization agreement would be, a no-brainer. I mean, what complicates it somewhat is there's some really, I don't even know who they are, but there is an Israeli license on the Israeli side of Aphrodite, and there's Ishai license, I think it's called. And there are Israeli companies that have the right to this license. They aren't firms that actually produce any oil or gas anywhere. So it seemingly is just some sort of financial investment on their behalf. But this is what it would take, some sort of unitization agreement involving them. It seems like it's only quite recently that the Cypriot Energy Ministry and Foreign Ministry has woken up to the fact that this is something that needs sorting out, because Chevron have been talking for a few months as if they want to, in the near term, move ahead with phase 2 development of Leviathan. And you would think if the Cypriots want Aphrodite development to be part of this, they need to sort out this sooner rather than later, because Chevron have options. There's a second direct onshore pipeline between Israel and Egypt that's been talked about as an option. There's FLNG as well. It's, there's other development options that would leave Cypriot gas out in the cold.
Okay, so it looks as if Egypt isn't going to be riding to Europe's rescue anytime soon. But how about a little bit further along the coast with Algeria?
Yeah, so we our North Africa editor, Aydin Çalık, he did a piece this week on looking at Algeria and exactly that question, whether Algeria can supply extra gas to Europe. Short answer is not really, no.
We'll end it there then.
Well, a somewhat longer answer is, his piece came on the back of Italy and Eni, the big Italian energy firm Eni, and the CEO Claudio Descalzi was in Algeria, basically a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He was straight away on the plane to Algiers, basically tapping up the Algerians, tapping up Sonatrach to say, look, if we're short of gas, will you give us first dibs on any extra supplies? And I think from an Italian perspective, that makes sense. Algeria they have 3 export gas pipelines, 2 to Spain and 1 to Italy. Obviously, anyone who keenly reads MEES will know one of the two ones to Spain is pretty much out of service for the foreseeable future. It goes via Morocco, and Morocco and Algeria have had a big falling out, and I don't see that situation getting fixed. Anyway, the issue with Algeria isn't the lack or surplus of export capacity; it's gas, basically. So there's plenty of spare capacity on the pipeline to Italy. The capacity is about 30 BCM a year. And to give you an idea, it actually shipped a record volume last year, which was 21. So there's plenty of spare capacity. It's just we don't think... Well, Algeria did raise their gas output a lot last year. They produced a record 100 BCM, and their exports were at a record as well. But we don't see that going any higher this year. They haven't got any new fields coming on. There's no reason to think they're not already maxing output at the moment. So for sure, in theory, if Italy needed the gas, they could supply Italy with a bit more gas. I mean, just to back a bit, Russia's Italy's biggest gas supplier at the moment, obviously. So if there was any threat to that, then Algeria could supply a bit more to Italy, but that would be gas that wouldn't be going elsewhere. So, Algeria has been selling some gas on the spot market. So you would imagine spot LNG sales would fall if they were supplying more to Italy. Let's presume that they were genuine when they said to Eni that they'd supply any extra that Eni needed. I mean, it would be understandable from a financial perspective if they maxed out sales on the spot market instead. But maybe other countries in Europe, whether it's Turkey's been a big buyer of Algerian gas. Turkey could ask them for more, and who's to say they're going to prioritize Italy over Turkey? Sometimes Algerian LNG goes to the UK, goes elsewhere. I mean, probably going forwards, the LNG that they sell on the spot market obviously goes to the highest paying buyer. You would imagine these volumes are mostly going to go to Europe, for the foreseeable future, rather than Asia, which has been an occasional buyer. But they're not going to squeeze out more gas overall. It's just a case of where it's going. And you can see Italy. I mean, I'm not surprised Italy's worried about, what might happen to their Russian supplies. But one would imagine as long as the Russian gas keeps flowing, there's no particular reason why they would be taking more from Algeria. It's just they're trying to line up a backup option, the way I see it.
There we have it. So turning away from gas, Yesar, even before the latest crisis, there were growing concerns over diminishing spare capacity within the OPEC Plus producer alliance. We've often flagged up Iraq as being one of the few countries within OPEC Plus that actually has substantial spare production capacity. But there are, of course, also significant political risks for Iraq. Now, you wrote in the last week about the oil minister there increasingly coming under political fire. So what's happening there?
Well, I mean, if you are going to speak political risk in regards to Iraq, then there is a lot, to say. But, well, I mean, let's just look at it this way from the top. This is a country that has been without a new government for the last 150 days, at least, since the early parliamentary elections were held. Now the parliament is, in a way, de facto in full power, and it seems that Mr. Ihsan Ismail, who's the oil minister, has become a target. He's the oil minister and also the president of the revived Iraqi National Oil Company. We have covered, in much detail how INOC was revived, reestablished, who sits on the board, and so on. I think we have covered that a lot. But in short, the whole law was supposed to come to separate between INOC and the ministry. And Mr. Ismail sits on both organizations. Also, there are a lot of integrations in terms of the staff. And, we cover Iraq a lot, and you are aware of what we do most of the time. And sometimes you don't even see any separation between INOC and the ministry. So Mr. Ismail was, in a way, forced to be removed from INOC by the parliament. Of course, there are political reasons. By the end of the day, there are forces beyond the industry itself which select who the executives are, especially at this very delicate time when it comes to government formation. And we spoke to senior sources which said that Mr. Ismail was having resistance from major political blocs, namely the Sadrists and Taqaddum, who have been aligning with the Kurdistan Democratic Party. They all have more than 170 seats of the 320 seats. Now, what does this mean for the industry? Mr. Ismail has portrayed himself as a supporter of IOCs. His maybe grand project is the 27 billion mega deal with Total. There are also signings with Sinopec for Mansouriya free gas development. He has been also supportive of the fifth licensing round. In other places, he has been holding talks with the Saudis on Akas, with Halliburton. So he's been trying to get the IOCs to do more in the country.
Big hopes for Chevron as well.
And yeah, of course, the Nasiriyah Districts project, whatever that is. Well, so he has been placing himself and portraying himself as a supporter of IOCs, and to lose him is a blow to many of these companies that are trying to enter the country, because he has been supportive, he has been accommodating, but at the same time, this doesn't impact what's really happening in Iraq. So one of the senior level sources that we were talking to said, since INOC and the Ministry of Oil are basically the same and the lines between them are murky, this is not going to impact the day-to-day operations. But in a way, this is going to bring in that political uncertainty that stands always as an obstacle to Iraq's efforts to bring in foreign investment into the country. So it's not going to be a great sign of things to come.
Yeah, I believe that he was pushing INOC quite hard to partner up with a lot of IOCs that he wanted to bring in. So on the one hand, they might be relieved that perhaps that won't happen, but equally they want to know, will the government position change on that? Will they be forced to partner with INOC or not? Is that going out of the window?
I mean, one case in particular that we have been following up on is Total Energy. So one of the problems that have been delaying things with Total, and sources have been telling us that Total is actually slow walking the process for two reasons. One, the government is a caretaker and you cannot move all the signatures that you need through the Iraqi bureaucracy at this point, because you don't want to bring in unnecessary risk in the future, especially that there are many of the new MPs who are apparently opposed to the Total Energies deal. So this is one big problem. But the other reason for slow walking is because Mr. Ismail has been trying to push INOC to come in as a 40% partner to the Total Energies deal. He indicated before in comments to the media that might be part of the gas capture project in Ratawi. But anyway, this basically brings in memories of BGC, Basra Gas Company, the joint venture between Shell, Mitsubishi, and South Gas Company, and all the delays in financing that they faced, because SGC was holding 51% of the joint venture and lots of financing had to come from BGC, and that had to be sourced from the federal budget itself. And usually that is quite politically impacted by what MPs want. So they want more jobs, they want benefits, and they don't want the extra billions to go to infrastructure projects because it's not a political priority.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how this progresses, and whether we're at 150 days without a government now. Will we hit 200? Let's hope not. But we've spoken a lot about oil. We've spoken about gas. Let's turn to another source of energy. Let's turn to nuclear, and that means Abu Dhabi. I think that one of the very interesting developments of late has been the startup of the Baraka nuclear power plant in Abu Dhabi, and we're really starting to see the results of that coming online now. Clean energy generation in Abu Dhabi accounted for more than 13% of total electricity generation for 2021. That is primarily down to nuclear power, not due to solar power, which they are, of course, also heavily investing in. And that's primarily just from one of Baraka's 4 units. With the other 3 planned units at varying degrees of readiness, clean energy power generation is set to soar in the coming years. Now, yes, a lot of this will go to meeting rising domestic demand, but it will still greatly reduce Abu Dhabi power sector's demand for gas. That, in turn, should free up volumes for use in its expanding petrochemicals sector, in its ambitious blue hydrogen plans, and to loop back around to gas concerns, could free up volumes for LNG exports. For now, LNG exports are capped at a modest 5.8 million tonnes a year capacity that ADNOC LNG has at its Das Island facilities. But ADNOC is exploring the option of establishing new LNG export facilities, possibly at the Indian Ocean terminal of Fujairah, as part of a strategy to double capacity to 12 million tonnes a year. That said, it's still going to be a multi-year project to get this up and running. And even if ADNOC opted for the swifter floating LNG technology, I think it's fair to say that we won't see any new volumes until the second half of the decade. Do you think that's fair, James?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, it sounds about right. I mean, there's quite a few big LNG projects around, and the Mauritania and Senegal, the gas that they've discovered there, I think there's a lot of gas. The best estimate is around 100 TCF of gas in place, and it's quite funny the changes in shift as regards the likelihood of this getting developed over the last 2 or 3 years. You know, the key operator of these blocks that's made these discoveries is BP, which is active off Mauritania and Senegal with Cosmos, a US firm as partner. And, you know, there were 2 big developments, if you like, in 2020. Firstly, oil prices totally cratered with COVID-19. But secondly, as well, BP's really shifted on their strategy in 2020, then again in 2021. And, you know, they made a thing of saying no new big projects, no new basins, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't 100% clear. This is upstream, obviously, not solar or renewables, right? So it was certainly last year, it was looking much less likely that these big reserves that have been discovered off Mauritania and Senegal would ever be fully developed. I mean, just to go back a bit, there's one project at the moment, Tortue it's called, which is right on the border, that's getting developed. But even there, this was long talked about as a 10 million tonnes a year LNG project. And at the moment, it's just phase 1, which is a quarter of that, 2.5 million tonnes a year getting developed. And then all these other big reserves that BP had discovered, it was like, well, these are going to have to be developed as the sort of mega projects that BP looks to have moved away from. So anyway, that was the picture until very recently. Obviously, what's changed in the recent months? Firstly, what changed is big gas shortage in Europe. Price has gone through the roof. And secondly, obviously, much more recently, there's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has brought supply security issues to the fore. So it was quite interesting. On their call last week, on their Q4 earnings call, Cosmos, BP's partner in these discoveries of Mauritania and Senegal, they were suddenly much more bullish on the prospects of developing a big second LNG export hub off Mauritania. They talked a lot about Europe as a key market, talked a lot about apparently they're hearing from companies a real desire, potential customers, a real desire to diversify sources of gas. And they've been bigging up as well the fact that this gas is very clean methane, as it were, with very low CO2 content, which, you know, at the margins makes it a greener project. I mean, obviously, you burn the methane, it still gives off CO2, right? You know, but there's a bit of spin in this, but yeah, for sure, it's suddenly looking like a much more likely project to get developed than it was a year or 2 ago. I mean, we'll see. These things, you know, these things change. You know, I'm not pretending that everyone will be saying the same thing in a year's time, but now it's looking much more positive. As regards global supply and demand, I mean, I think Tortue phase 1, which is quite small, is due to come on in Q3 next year. Then Tortue phase 2, if it goes ahead, could come on in 2025. Anything else, I think we're looking at 2026, or more likely 27, 28, something like that is a potential time frame. So this isn't something that's going to come to Europe's rescue in the next year or two, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say about the CO2 intensity, methane intensity there for the Mauritanian stuff. That's also something that the partners in Israel are flagging up at Leviathan, I think, is the relatively low carbon footprint there. And I think that we're also going to see, obviously the high prices lead to help raise investment for these developments, but also I think we'll see something of marketing ourselves as not Russian gas to try and bring investment in as well. So everybody looking to shore up security of supply. Well, that's all that we have time for today. So thank you, James and Yesar, for an excellent discussion. And thank you to all of our listeners. If you have any questions on any of the topics that we discussed today, or indeed any of the ones that you wished we had discussed today, feel free to email me on jingram@mees.com or message me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.